Thank you, Andrew, for a very generous introduction. Thank you for asking me to give the talk. I'm not sure I am the ideal person to do it, but I'm the only person you've got here this evening, so you'll have to make do with that. I mean, it's quite strange for me. This is foreign territory. I work in the economics department at Warwick, and the business school is really a foreign country to me, so I'm very impressed to see what beautiful new surroundings they've got. Glad to see that it's being used so well. Okay, you've got on your seats, I think, the splendid new report that the Centre has done. It really is excellent. I'm going to talk round it in a sense, that is to say, I agree with most of it, apart from perhaps some differences of emphasis, but I'm going to try and put it in context. I'm going to try and draw out one or two of the analytics a bit more deeply perhaps, and prompt one or two policy questions which I think are implicit in what you've done, but possibly not made quite so explicit. I have got very interested in the last about 15 years in economic geography, in particular the new economic geography, and how it relates to economic history. I'm still sort of feeling my way because I don't think there's much of an interface between those literatures. But increasingly there will be, because there's quite an opportunity intellectually there. So let me whiz through a bit of context before we get to the sort of more specific stuff. First of all, globalisation is clearly the context of a lot of what happens. Britain's been an open economy for a very long time, more or less open. We've been through two globalisations that really matter, in the 19th century and again in the latter part of the 20th century and today. Globalisation I see as integration of markets. The implication of integration of markets and these lower trade costs and so on is potentially that economic activity relocates when that happens, and we've been through quite a lot of that recently. I'll prompt a bit more of that. The two big episodes, though, I think have quite important differences. And in a sense, what we've got and been coping with for some decades is the legacy of the first of those globalisations. And let me call that the first unbundling, and use the term second unbundling for what's been happening recently. Not my original terminology. Those of you who know this literature will recognise Richard Baldwin lying behind that. Okay, so two unbundlings then. The first unbundling, I think, is the trade cost, the globalisation of the 19th century, and you start to see production and consumption of manufactures in very different locations. So you've got long-distance trade, if you like, of important items, not just spices or luxuries or whatever. The production takes place in a relatively concentrated fashion, spatially concentrated at least, and that production centre then exports to the rest of the world, if you will. I think the classic example, which I want to talk about quite a bit in a moment or two, is Lancashire and Lancashire cotton. Lancashire is very much the centre of the cotton industry throughout the 19th century, and it represents a very classic example of this first unbundling. The second unbundling, which we've been going through, I think, in about the last 30 years, something like that, really comes with the ICT revolution. It really comes with computers. It really comes with another change in technology. I think what this is doing is creating supply chains which are much more complex. It's creating many more stages of production. Manufactures are built, the value added in a manufacture is built up from perhaps many locations in many stages. My classic example at the bottom, not a typo, I deliberately put that in inverted commas, German car. Germany may be where it's finally exported from, but a German car typically has components from all sorts of different places. Okay, we know that there's been a big switch in industrial production in the world. That's a very long-run view. Not many people know how to put these numbers together. I do, so I thought you ought to see them as well. There they are. They're probably a bit rough and ready. I wouldn't go to the decimal point. But nevertheless, I think they do tell us the story. In the late 19th century, that's the point at which we think of the UK as the workshop of the world. That's a phrase that's been used quite often. That's really a quite astonishing proportion of world industrial production to be in a country as small as the UK. By 2010, we're back to sort of where we were in the 18th century, 2 or 3%, and perhaps China is heading back to where it was in the 18th century as well. So we've seen quite big switches in the world industrial production. It became very European and North American through the 19th century. It's been becoming more Asian in the recent past in particular. Some people crudely say that the recent past is the death of distance. In fact, the chair of the advisory board of my research centre published a book called The Death of Distance. I haven't let her forget it since, because that is really quite silly. Distance is absolutely not dead. The Mark Twain comment in the middle there is surely exactly right. This is greatly exaggerated. But every time technology changes in a big way, then I do think it rearranges geography. It doesn't mean that geography doesn't matter anymore, but it means the old geography is to some extent obsolete, and we see adjustment taking place. We saw that in the steam age. I think we're seeing that in today's world as well. Okay, competitive advantage. In a global economy, it's quite important to know what your competitive advantage is. Countries tend to specialise. They tend to specialise where they have a cost advantage. Various things can contribute to that. It could be the factor endowments you have, the natural resources, the human capital, whatever. Maybe you're ahead in the technology in something. And I think agglomerations are a key source of competitive advantage. And that's the link really to the work of the centre and possibly what you're interested in this evening. Over time, certainly since the 19th century, the UK has moved from manufactures to services. Its exports are now much more knowledge-based, and I think that's a big theme in the report, in effect. And if we've been through those changes, a key feature, I think, is that has and will require spatial adjustment within the UK. The locations which were optimal in the 19th century for economic activity are no longer quite so optimal now. I'm not going to do what a former colleague of mine once did this evening and suggest that we actually close down Sunderland. I think that probably would be a mistake. But I do think over time it's correct, right, that Sunderland has become sort of a bit smaller relative, say, to Milton Keynes or wherever it might be. Shares of manufactured exports, again, just to show that big change in the UK position. We counted actually, even on the eve of the First World War, still for over a quarter of the world's manufactured exports. We're now down to about 3%. And increasingly, our market share is in services. We export services to a substantial extent. That's probably our future. Okay, bit of jargon just to check we're on the same page. I'm going to suggest that cities matter because they raise productivity. Cities raise productivity in particular because they generate what in the economics literature you would call agglomeration externalities. I think it's quite useful here to distinguish between two different types. Alfred Marshall, I'm an undergraduate from so long ago they were still using Marshall's textbook, or at least the lazier tutors were when I was a student. The phrase they used to use was, "Sonny, it's all in Marshall." Actually, that won't be entirely inappropriate this evening. Quite a lot was in Marshall. Alfred Marshall then stressed the gains from specialisation. I think that is by far the most important source of externalities, but because it is, as your competitive advantage disappears, you're going to need to invent a new specialisation or your city is going to become obsolete. Jane Jacobs thought about a different sort of externality. She emphasised the role of diversity. The role of spillovers between sectors rather than just the building up of productivity gains within sectors. I do think we can see some traces of those kinds of externalities, but broadly speaking, I think they're probably quite a lot less important in almost every case. Externalities of this kind then raise productivity and explain why we have cities. We've got to have something there which offsets, if you like, the expense of being in the city. And those of you who live around here know all about that, I suspect. Those of us like me who live in the provinces, that's just a sort of interesting spectator sport. But then people like me are permanently shut out of ever joining London. Where do externalities come from? I think basically they accrue partly through learning. So this is the development of knowledge, often tacit knowledge or local knowledge, not necessarily totally easy to write down. Marshall then would be, I suppose, arguing that those learning effects occur within an industry very largely. Jacobs would be arguing that there are spillovers between industries. So cities are good places for learning, might be the argument here. Matching is a second sort of argument. This is really in particular probably having a big labour pool, helping the matching of employers and workers, probably conducive to the building up of skills. Sharing, well, sharing might be things like sharing specialised inputs. This is dealing with the problem of indivisibilities, if you like. Sharing those inputs is something which, again, is achieved by things like the proximity of businesses and their very specialised suppliers. That's the sort of thing we might be talking about. The optimal size of the city, well, typically we find that productivity does increase with city size, at least over quite a large range and as best we can measure it. As cities get bigger, there are offsets to the productivity gains, and those are the congestion effects, if you like. The congestion effects are various things becoming more expensive, more crowded, and eventually these congestion effects perhaps start to outweigh the externalities, so that the net wage for people in the city starts actually to decrease. City size, maybe, don't know why I'm mentioning this in Britain of today, city size may even be suboptimal if it's restricted by regulation or inadequate transport. If you are thinking of the decision to change the transport system or something like that, then the cost-benefit analysis that you should do should surely take into account these wider economic benefits such as externalities. I think public policy does recognise that. It was there, for example, in the case for Crossrail even 10 years ago. If a new, better technology comes along or new, better specialisation, the net wage curve will go up. So net wage is what the worker's receiving, taking away all those costs of living. The best place to stop for city size is at the peak of that net wage curve. If a new opportunity comes along, such that the best thing to do would be to move out from point A to point B, and you're restricted and you can't do it, the interesting thing is that the losses that are there, which I've put in that purple, or cerise is it, depends on your eyesight I suppose, actually this imposes a welfare loss on the people already living in the city, because they will actually gain from the increase in city size. That's often forgotten and not well dealt with in British public policy. Again, continuing the background very quickly, we know that Britain has deindustrialised, particularly over the last 50 years, been pretty much continuous from the late 1960s. The reasons for deindustrialisation are pretty common in the advanced world. People demand more services, productivity grows more quickly in manufacturing, comparative advantage in manufacturing has been shifting away to Asia and so on. But the implication of that is the structure of employment has changed hugely over time. That really is a massive context for this change in the portfolio of cities. So if we very quickly look at employment shares crudely done, even in 1951 we'd got a small agricultural sector, but look, industry accounts for nearly 45% of the workforce. Industry, of course, includes things like construction and the public utilities, so it's a bit bigger than just manufacturing, in case you're thinking of numbers that are at the back of your mind. By last year, industry's down to about 15% of the workforce. So that tells us that if cities in the past relied on lots of industrial jobs, those jobs are probably not there to anything like the same extent now. You'd like a bit of detail? Why not? In the early 20th century, 12% of all British employment was in the textile industry, together with clothing. That's so small now we can hardly observe it. It's 0.3%. Engineering, well, that peaked somewhere in the 1950s, about 11% of employment in 1951, down to about 2% now. Looking on the other side, and this I think is very much captured in the Cities report, the big gaining sector in the recent past has been financial and business services. And that accounts for a large part of our growing exports. It's striking, incidentally, but I'll pass on because it's not relevant this evening really, how few people worked in education and health in 1911. That really is a striking number. Suggests the British weren't very educated, and we know they weren't very healthy. Okay? Comparative advantage then has changed markedly over time. I think that more or less repeats what I've said. But I talk to undergraduates so much these days, and you have to say it about 8 times already. They think they haven't got their £9,000 worth. I should only have to say it probably 5 or 6 times after the election, because they'll be down to £6,000. Allegedly. We will see. Okay, so I'll probably more or less skip that. But if you look at what Britain had comparative advantage in manufacturing 100 years ago or thereabouts, those are very much the Victorian staple industries, at least that's what the history textbooks call them. I'm proud of 1937. Look at our best performing sector, alcohol and tobacco. Yes, I think we can, all British people can be really proud of that. Looking at the more recent past, what do you see? You see industries which are not labour intensive at all. They don't really employ all that many people. They are knowledge intensive, they are human capital intensive, and in many cases they are R&D intensive. Even the stone and glass is probably quite design intensive, not conventional R&D. But if you look at what our revealed comparative advantage is across the P's, revealed comparative advantage, remember, is your world market share basically. In what activities do we have the highest world market share? The top 5 there are all services. That is a very different world to which we've had to adjust, and it's the adjustment problem which perhaps has bothered us in a way. Pharmaceuticals coming in at number 6 overall is the top manufacturing sector. Okay, in that context, I'm not going to dwell on London as a financial centre. You may want to come back to it. But I do think London is a classic example of what Marshall was talking about as far as the financial sector is concerned. And the financial sector, we know from lots and lots of empirical research, is one where these externalities really matter a lot. So size matters, big is better. If you get ahead, you're going to find it quite hard to be displaced. The world can perhaps accommodate 5 or 6 world-class financial centres. It's not going to be easy for someone else to displace London. Don't know whether you see that as good news or bad news. Okay. Now, let me turn to the history for a little while. 19th century industrial location decisions. I've withheld it until now, but I do have a penchant for self-citation. So we're starting with the self-citation at this point, an unduly neglected paper which I published some years ago, but which you might now like to read. It's in the Journal of Economic History, just in case you're already searching for it on your mobile device, written with a very good colleague. We took quite a lot of time to look at why industry was where it was in the 19th, early 20th century, in fact. I think the location decisions then are not made on the same basis as now. The things that matter, proportion, the weight of the things that matter is different. So a crucial thing in the 19th century, this was what drove the north-south divide of the period. Remember, that's when the north is in the up. Most of the rest of history, the south has been in the up. This is the north's short interlude. I was born too late, sadly. Okay, proximity to sources of power really mattered. That was things like water power, fast-flowing streams, that sort of thing, which would drive mills in the early phase. It's a world where steam power is going to become the dominant general-purpose technology. Steam requires coal, basically, as a key input. Coal is very expensive to transport, at least across land. in the 19th century, at least until the railway era and even after that. So you want to be close to sources of power. You also want market access, that matters. You want to be able to sell your stuff and in some key cases import your inputs. In that context you need to be close to the transport network. But the transport network is dominated by water and then rail. It doesn't include the, sorry, I've got a typo there, internal combustion engine. Okay? Not the industrial combustion engine. That's the sort of thing the spell checker never throws up. You bugger. Okay, so internal combustion engine. The coming of motor transport, the end of the importance of water or coal, is a massive boost to the south and the Midlands compared with the north. That's the 20th century story. But the Industrial Revolution period was one of very heavy spatial concentration of industries, and much of outer Britain, I use that phrase because it was what earlier generations used. You'll find that in the officialese of the 1930s, not very politically correct today, except since I come from outer Britain, you know, you could insult your own tribe, so it's probably sort of allowable. Much of outer Britain was very specialised. Think of Wales and coal. Think of the northeastern shipbuilding. Think of Lancashire and textiles, and so on. Okay, more ruthless self-citation. You see it's crept in again. If your eyesight's not very good, Crafts and Wolf is this one. Okay, also in the Journal of Economic History. Admirable journal. Excellent taste in the authors that it publishes. Lancashire had a ferocious proportion of world cotton textile activity in the 19th century. Nearly half of all spindles in the world is pretty large fraction for a very small area in the world landmass. It's sustained for a very long time. I think the fact it's sustained for such a long time is really interesting, because this is an activity where by quite early in the 19th century the technology starts to be well diffused, and your basic guess is this is something which ought to gravitate to regions where labour is cheap. In the end it does, but not until the interwar period or even after World War II. Lancashire maintains its preeminence for a very long time, despite being a high-wage centre. I think the only way we can explain that is Lancashire as a very successful agglomeration. If you happen to come from the bits of the West Riding or Cheshire, which are really part of that same agglomeration, forgive me, but I'll carry on with the shorthand Lancashire, if you don't mind. Lancashire dominated on the basis of second nature geography, more jargon. That's basically the agglomeration. I've done what our colleague said I shouldn't do. I've blanked the screen. Can I unblank it? Technical person? The blanking button is, I'm afraid, right next to the pressing. It's a good job I'm not a Bond dealer. You know, that's a fat finger moment that could have cost us some massive amount of money. But fortunately, all I've done is turn the slides off. But even so, this is actually the bit of the slides where you'll enjoy the pictures. If we can get the pictures back.
Please just go and have a look, so we can in a second.
I think we will have to pause. I can't really talk on.
Nick, nice something.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, good moment for some Q&A.
You know, you talked about the welfare loss issue, and you talked about the welfare loss being for existing residents in the city.
I blanked it, I'm afraid.
You talked about welfare loss being to existing.
With the fat finger.
Existing city residents.
Yeah.
Does that welfare loss also include the generic loss to those out with the city? I think there's an interesting question about whether it was both, but this question about...
Yeah, the diagram is showing the loss to the people already there, the incumbents, if you like.
But the loss to the existing residents is a powerful argument against NIMBYism, which doesn't ever seem to come out very much in the discussion.
No, because it seemed, I think that's exactly right. I'm glad you picked that up, because I was half hinting at it. Yeah, I mean, I think the existing residents tend to be very aware of the congestion cost aspect of the story, much less aware of the productivity gains. You know, as a resident, you can see house prices going up, or you know, your district somehow becoming more crowded than it was. Residents can't see productivity. though they might eventually feel it in their pay packet, and they would according to that diagram, but connecting one with the other is, I think, very difficult to do. I think it's an important point because it suggests there's a kind of asymmetry of political response here. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Now, here are some pictures. I told you there were. That tells you that cotton employees are found disproportionately in one bit of Britain in 1838. It's a very detailed survey. I don't think it would be very different if we did this for 1875 or 1911, so I'm going to rely on this. Lancashire, why did the cotton industry end up in Lancashire? Well, Douglas Farney is the prime writer here. He died a few years ago. He is the doyen of the writers of this sort of economic history. He says Lancashire's basic advantages were its poverty. That basically says it's not a good area to do agriculture in. You know, you wouldn't want to put the cotton industry in East Anglia for several reasons. One, because it's prime arable land. Second, because it doesn't have fast running water on the whole, and so on. Its water supply, that's what he means, the fast running streams and so on. Its climate. Farney was very impressed by the fact that Lancashire was humid. And certainly when I went to school, we were all taught that the cotton industry had been in Lancashire because of its humidity. Bollocks. That is completely wrong, according to the econometrics, and I'll show you a map which suggests that it's wrong in just a minute. That's a technical term, incidentally, much used in economics. The acquired advantages, that's the agglomeration. This is the building up of the specialised supply, the access to the markets of Liverpool and Manchester, and the mercantile skills which go with that, the auxiliary industries, the building up of a specialised transport network. All these are facilities which can be shared. This is Marshall in action, essentially. Okay, that's a measure of water flow. It's about water pressure in a sample of rivers in the areas concerned, which is exceeded for 95% of the time. Red is good news there. If water pressure was everything that mattered, you'd obviously go to the Highlands of Scotland. Not a good place to go for all sorts of reasons, some of which I won't dwell on now. Okay? Coal, that's a crucial feature of the 19th century. Red is very expensive. This map is not detailed enough to show London, which was, of course, able to import coal from Newcastle. But basically, the south of Britain is a very high coal price region as of the mid-19th century. If you want low coal prices, you might go to Lancashire, you might go to Durham, you won't go to the south. That's a fundamental aspect of the north-south divide of 100 or 150 years ago, which is basically not relevant today at all. So we're talking about something which will leave a footprint for much of the 20th century, but it's kind of obsolete. And there's humidity. I think Farney had been watching too many test matches at Old Trafford, which had ended with rain. Actually, Lancashire is quite humid, but so is much of the rest of Britain. In fact, all of Britain is humid enough for cotton textiles, quite easily so. It's not a specific advantage of Lancashire, and the econometrics, which Wolf and I did, wipes it out. Basically, for this industry, a cheap source of power was a necessary condition. They do want to be near to ports. They don't want humidity. It doesn't matter at all to the location. The industry, in the end, sort of amalgamates and a subset of its original locations. But here's the rub in the end. Even in 1910, Lancashire dominates world trade in cotton, despite being a very high-wage industry. The way you sustain those high wages is through a very successful agglomeration. That's an important message for today, it seems to me. The rest of the world found that very hard to replicate. The policy, we might just want to reflect on why Lancashire was able to do this. I think a very crucial feature is Lancashire's growth was not constrained by strict planning rules. So we see towns like Blackburn, Preston, whatever it is, growing extremely quickly in a way that, say, their modern counterparts, Oxford and Cambridge, say, are not allowed to. Growth was supported by private sector major transport investments that required a lot of parliamentary support in one way or another. And in the long run, to allow cities to grow, that transport investment was important, but so in the end were local public goods, including health. What do we know about agglomeration externalities 100 years ago? I think the evidence is overwhelming that they were almost entirely Marshallian. By that I mean there's very little evidence at all for Jacobian externalities. The diversity story does not work in 19th century or early 20th century cities. At least I don't think it does. Work that I'm just about to put out with Alex Klein. We've been looking in a lot of detail at American cities at this time because it's possible to do much more detailed work than the British data doesn't permit. Increased specialisation in American cities is a major factor in their productivity growth around the turn of the 20th century. Transport innovations underpin that. I can think of two. One is the streetcar, what we would call the tram, which is an absolutely massively important urban investment. And the other is the sort of completion of the railroad network, the reduction of barriers to trade across America so that cities can trade for more of what they don't produce themselves. At least up to 800,000 people, diversity as we measure it reduces productivity. It's just increasing congestion costs. I think that's really quite an important point. How many American cities had more than 800,000 people? That's one for the fast-fingered Googlers in the room. 5 is the answer. If you can name them afterwards, I might buy you a beer. Okay, the legacy then of this first industrialisation is an industrial geography that's out of date and creates a major adjustment challenge. Cities need to develop new specialisations, and too much of the population at the start is in the north. And one of the reasons for that, and here is a point where I slightly disagree with the emphasis in the cities report, is I think it's market to access which is part of the story there. Let me just try and illustrate that with an example which is very well documented, and then a speculation that the same sort of thing applies to Britain. Economists are increasingly interested in natural experiments to look at causality. I think you could think of the division of Germany as a natural experiment in a way. Redding and Sturm's paper in the American Economic Review basically exploits that experiment. What it shows is two things. We all know population growth in the cities close to the new border was very much smaller than cities elsewhere in West Germany. But the econometrics these guys did, I think convincingly says that is almost entirely explained by the shutting off of market access. The closer you are to the border, the more you've lost through not being able to trade with East Germany. That's the key feature. Now, think of that for the UK. What's the big natural experiment we've done? We joined the EU, I think 40 years ago. It's possible we're about to undo that, though I doubt I shall live to give the talk that would be based on the subsequent natural experiment. But looking at the work that Henry Overman and Alan Winters did, it's very clear that EU entry changes the orientation of our trade through the ports. It's very clear that it moves manufacturing establishments closer to the south. They don't quite have the same sums as Redding and Sturm, but I'm going to suggest then that market access is something which has favoured the south over the north, and it would encourage your portfolio of cities to move south and grow bigger in the south. We know that regional GDP varies a lot across Britain per person. Those figures are slightly misleading, but nevertheless they show the southeast very high, they show London very, very high. Where do those regional disparities come from? And that's, I think, our clue to thinking about the portfolio of cities we might have. I'm short of time, so I'm clicking through the animation here. I think those big differences in regional GDP per head are partly explained by demography, the age structure and so on of the population. They're partly explained by the fact that more people work in the southeast as a proportion of the population than in other parts of Britain, and they are distorted by the fact that we don't have a proper regional price index. That's something the Treasury experimented with about 10 years ago and hasn't repeated. Regional price differences are non-trivial in Britain. Nevertheless, there is a real thing there. The productivity difference, which is real, and we can, I think, drill down and extract that in a moment, does partly reflect the fact that people congregate in specific places. Sorting. London has far more high human capital people than Sunderland, if I may say so. And of course lots of other places as well. If you come from Sunderland, I do apologise. But the fact that you're here probably says something as well. So to some extent, in fact to a large extent, what we see when we look at those numbers is people, sorting of people, rather than place per se. We'd like to be able to extract the place per se, and I'll try and do that in a moment. When we do try and do that, it is very clear that the South East has a productivity advantage. The regional disparities, I think, have tended to grow in globalisation periods. London's dominance is biggest just before the First World War, and now it wasn't so big in 1971, if you looked at those numbers. Wage differences across labour market areas, that's just minimum to maximum. In Britain it's about 157 different labour market areas. P90 means the 90th percentile, as per usual. The raw data says there are very big average wage differences. It's just average earnings per person. When you control for various things like age, experience, gender, education, you can think of the standard sort of things you might want to control for, then those big disparities get narrowed down, but it's not gone away altogether. So there is something more that's there. So what's the something more? I think the something more is that TFP, Total Factor Productivity, familiar acronym to many people I think, Total Factor Productivity is different across Britain today. Let me commend what I think is an excellent study by Richard Harris and John Moffat in the Journal of Regional Science 2012. I think this is the best study we've got at the moment. They show that if you measure very carefully total factor productivity by looking at a massive micro sample of business activities in different regions, all other regions are significantly lower than the South East. It is true that cities have higher productivity than the regions in which they're located, so we get the justification for cities. We find that although the economy has changed, the basis of these productivity differences still appears to be specialisation, insofar as they come from agglomeration externalities, and those agglomeration externalities are non-trivial. We find very little evidence of Jacobian externalities except in high-tech manufacturing. That's where the spillovers from diversity seem to be, and in terms of the literature, if anybody's familiar with it, some people think that's something to do with what they call nursery cities. Here are the externality elasticities that you can get from Harris and Moffat. That basically says if you double the size of an activity, what's the percentage increase in TFP that you see? So where you're seeing 5.8, that says if you double the size of the activity, productivity will go up by nearly 6%. It's basically how to read the table. Cunning colour coding here just to draw your attention to the statistically significant positives. Most of the statistically significant positives are in the specialisation column. I didn't hammer the point, but look at the diversity column. That basically says on the whole having lots and lots more activities in your city reduces productivity rather than increases it. And several of those are not only quite big elasticities, but they're also highly statistically significant. Here's the one for the Warwick Business School. The study actually looks at core cities in Britain and asks in which cities are there agglomeration externalities in manufacturing taken altogether or services taken altogether. Their sample is core cities. You'll look at the original paper to see the full list. Only 2 cities show up in manufacturing, Birmingham and Coventry. And in services, it's Birmingham, Edinburgh and Glasgow. But this is a rather strict test. It's saying, are the externalities there big enough to make those cities a better place to be than the South East? It's not saying meters the size of elasticities in total. Some implications as I get to the end of my time, Andrew. Policies that restrict the southeast have a significant productivity penalty. I don't think we take nearly enough account of that, so that's my first thing. Second thing is, successful cities, I think, will have to go through a lifetime and another lifetime and so on of developing successive specialisations. If specialisation is the key to externalities and high productivity, then your specialisation may not last forever. Okay, British cities surely aren't big enough in many cases. I've made that point already, so I'll skip on. Why aren't they big enough? Well, one very major reason that we all know, but it's a nettle we can't grasp, is because in the southeast we have draconian planning controls which basically prevent the expansion of the region and sufficient in-migration. Just a final sort of thought about the second unbundling. I think we do live in a world of value chains. The value chains are more complex and more globalised than 100 years ago. I think it makes the concept of manufacturing as we once knew it largely redundant. I think we're talking about activities which we purchase, which are essentially a bundle of value added, which has come from services, it's come from manufacturing, it's come from both pre and post fabrication services. I was recently on the Foresight study of manufacturing. We took evidence from quite a lot of people. One of them was Rolls-Royce. Turns out Rolls-Royce makes at least half of its money from services, which is not what we normally think about. I think they'll in future be making much more than half of their money from services, although they'll remain a manufacturer. What I think we don't understand, and here's the thing missing in a way from the report, and I hope it'll be the next step, is if these value chains matter and people gain from proximity to their suppliers in the Marshallian sense, then I think the key question is who wants to co-locate with whom? Co-location becomes an absolutely key issue. But no sensible person should think of rebalancing the economy towards manufacturing. They should think of rebalancing the economy, if they want to do so, to these supply chain bundles. Business services is actually where real engineering will be. Few people seem yet to have really clocked that. And yes, I've not blanked it. There we are. Just a little light relief. I got somebody to do that for me for a talk I gave a couple of years ago. I decided it would be a shame to waste it. It's a bit beyond my animation skills. But you see the point. People so often think that you can extract the value from manufacturing. The value chain is such that the actual manufacturing stages now have little to do with that. This does link to the report. What it says is that the value chain will deliver lots of value in knowledge-intensive services which are part of one of these chains. Not in the manufacturing itself, actually quite good to let China do that. This is a very old slide. Does anybody still have a Nokia phone? Possibly the odd sort of antiquarian. That's the value added in a Nokia phone a few years ago. Notice Nokia's intangibles, very high proportion of it. Successful cities then, I think if we've got a portfolio, we'll want mainly talent towns, that's this Netherlands report, their jargon, that's Marshallian specialised activity. A few cosmopolitan centres, because we probably can get some Jacobian externalities out of them, that might be Manchester and Birmingham and perhaps Glasgow, and London, which will be a financial centre supreme, you might imagine. Okay, and you basically need policy to facilitate that portfolio. Planning rules do matter. They impose massive costs on businesses in some cases. I do think that's a spectacular finding in the second bullet point. That you've actually got planning rules which make offices seriously more expensive in Britain than elsewhere. And then the sort of challenge both for cities and for industrial policy makers is thinking about who wants to do what, where, and exactly why. I think our aim will be, through successful cities, to try and capture those high value added parts of the value chain. I think that's completely different from being successful in 19th century industry. We're looking at a different sort of city and a different sort of economy altogether. Yes, I always try and end up with conclusions. This is where the sort of student who's been asleep for the last hour, £9,000 gov that I'm paying you, tell me what I should have learned. I slept through it, but I just need the 3 or 4 bullet points for the exam. My 2-1, I've already paid for it, haven't I? Yes, you have, essentially. That's how British universities work these days. Okay, my conclusions are that cities today raise productivity much as they did in the past, in one sense, namely through what I'll call Marshallian externalities. You've got a better set of jargon to take away with you this evening to the pub, for the pub quiz. I'll try and get that one in the standard pub quiz packet before too long. Today's optimal portfolio of cities and activities is obviously hugely different from that of a century ago, but we've still not completed the adjustment. We've slowed the adjustment down, we've distorted it by poor policy choices. Flexible adjustment to globalisation we did achieve to a large extent in the 19th century. It's what we will need to achieve in the 21st century. And my hobby horse, I really do think we need to think pretty hard about what kind of planning system we should have. Okay?
Thank you very much indeed. So we've heard from Professor Crafts. I've got lots of questions for him. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for reflections or questions from you in the audience. We've got some roving mics, so just wait until the mic comes to you, say who you are, and then ask your question or make your point. We'll try and collect a couple.
In that case, I need a pen just to write them down.
We'll take a couple, and then we'll get Nick to respond. Just raise your hands in the usual way. Thank you very much. One at the front.
Thank you.
One there. Looking for one more. One there. Right. Okay. Mic here. Where's the other mic? Just there. If you give it, yeah. Say who you are.
Thank you. Terence Bendixson, University of Southampton. An observation more than a question. I just noticed a graphic the other day which pointed to the fact that in China the major form of industrial production nowadays is textiles, clothing and shoes. And that really astonished me, and it made me ask the question, is there a similarity there between Lancashire and textiles in the English Industrial Revolution and the contemporary Chinese Industrial Revolution?
Great. Okay, we'll take a couple more. Oh, have you got one there? Yeah. One. And where was the other gentleman? Who's there? Just there.
Okay.
Yeah. Say who you are.
Yeah, Robert Chapman. I'm a chartered surveyor and regeneration practitioner based in Cardiff and also Bristol. A rather humble question to the professor. Agglomeration, I get it, I understand it. Clear focus on economics, if you like. I was just interested in your views on the kind of social and environmental dimensions vis-a-vis sustainability.
Okay, great.
Mark Flessing, Chief Executive of Pocket. We develop starter homes for Londoners. I'd be very interested to hear the Professor's projection 50 years hence on the question of how many core cities in the UK will have a GDP that sits above the national average. I mean, today we only have Bristol, which matches London in having a GDP that's above the national average. In Germany, all core cities have a GDP that's above the national average. What would your view be of our situation in 50 years' time?
Right. So, parents and compare China with Lancashire, are there similarities? What are the stories? Robert, where does the economic and environmental come up against the economic considerations around agglomeration? And are big cities underperform in the UK, unlike other places? What are some of the issues? Professor?
On the China one, yeah, I imagine there are agglomeration effects there in China. China is still at a quite low level of real GDP per person, if we measure it properly, although wages are rising quite quickly. It's not surprising to find a competitive advantage in that kind of sector, which is relatively labour intensive in most instances. So I'd see this as an early stage of development phase, which I'd imagine the Chinese are going to move beyond before much longer, and we'll probably see more powerful agglomerations in other activities. And that will leave them with the same kind of adjustment problem that I've been trying to describe for us. The social and environmental, they are hidden in this talk, and they're certainly not my expertise. But in a sense, I think what we're saying here is that if we try and unpack the idea of the net wage curve, remember that diagram from early on, then I think if we approach it sensibly, we'd be saying that the wages which an employee, a person working in one of these cities receives, do include surely some amenity value, if we want to call it that. So actually you'll need to pay them less because they'll get real wages of another kind if you provide them with nice green spaces, for instance, which we know matter in cities. We know that if we go back to the 19th century, got some very good evidence, econometrically very well looked through, that if you have a bad city environment, you end up having to pay much higher wages. The problem that 19th century cities had was dealing with the politics of that. The manufacturers actually understood it quite well. The shopkeepers typically didn't want the property rates to go up, and it ended up with lots of local politics fighting. But if Preston, for example, had had a proper water system in 1850, the estimates suggest it would have been able to pay its workers about 15% less. So there really is a quite close connection. If you're thinking a bit further, then if we think about the congestion costs, those clearly come potentially from, there's two sorts of meanings here. One is the bidding up of house prices and the implications that has, and that you may be touching on that. Also, I think we are talking about congestion in the sense of clogged roads. We're talking about the pollution that goes with that. Those are all things which actually one should be thinking of addressing by appropriate action on this other sort of externality, if I can call it that. So, like most economists, my instincts are to think that road pricing schemes have something to be said for them, and we might again be thinking of pricing other externalities. So I don't think we want to throttle the city by regulating its size. We would like to price some of these unfortunate side effects of economic activity. How many core cities might have GDP higher than the national average? I suspect we would probably be talking about quite a few if we're successful, not very many if we're not. By which I mean it's perfectly possible to think of a world in which London, or Greater London, dominates to the extent that it has such an effect on the national average that other cities find it hard to keep up. So I think your observation really in a way reflects the huge dominance of London. And let me add in again the fact that we do not measure regional GDP correctly. Those productivity figures that Richard Harris and John Moffat produced have dealt with the price problem at the level of the enterprise. But when we look at prices in London, I did a paper for the Welsh Assembly a few years ago and looked at what we got on the difference between prices in London and in Cardiff. Basically, you've got to take out about 20% difference or something for the difference in the price level. So once we actually get the numbers correct, the disparities will be a bit less than we currently think they are. So I think what I'm saying then is the challenge for the policymaker is to find a bundle of successful cities outside London so that they challenge its dominance. I don't know how successful we're going to be at that. I think we do see some good signs. I think you probably would argue that there have been positive developments in Manchester and Birmingham, for example, even if the numbers aren't quite where you'd like them to be. But I'm not really sure whether we'll be successful in that or not. Whereas I do think London will continue to be very successful as a financial centre. So I think the agglomeration advantages it has are very hard to replicate.
And Nick, if you looked into the future in 20 or 30 years or even longer, and London continued to dominate in the way that it does, would that give you pause for concern or not? Because that's part of the narrative, which is London's dominant, and actually that's bad for the for the rest of the country. Where are you on that?
I think I would see the likely story being that we've allowed the South East to develop more than it has at the moment. We've removed some of these restrictions. We've realised this isn't entirely sustainable. So I think I'd be looking at a much larger, greater London and a significant fraction higher than now of the population living in the South East.
Okay, great. Questions?
Well, that may not be great.
Okay, so we'll take a group. We'll take Richard at the front, this lady here, then you, and I'll come to you next. Just keep your... Richard, say who you are.
Okay, so Richard McCarthy, currently at Capita, but I better reveal myself to you. Before that, I was the Director General responsible for urban policy, housing and planning. So I'm going to ask you about planning. But however, before that, let's just recognise the power of your arguments. And actually, I am delighted to say that for what it's worth, the argument has held, and by and large certainly been given by officials, about actually squeezing productivity in the South East only benefits other parts of the world. And in fact, more people need to say this more often and more loudly, because it still is misunderstood and gets confused with political argument, and confused with the importance of recognising your argument to enable growth in cities elsewhere in the country. However, on planning, simple question, laissez-faire or more proactive?
Okay, just pause for that one.
Just
Laissez-faire
hang on
or
while I write that
more
down.
proactive. Really that? Yeah, just say who you are.
It's the question I was going to ask.
Very good. Then we'll get the answer. So the lady in the middle of the row there, just pass the mic down. And then I'll come to you. Just say who you are.
Carla from Siemens. I was just wondering if, it might not be your area of expertise, but the role of migration or immigration on cities and productivity, if you know anything about this.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Simon Hicks, the LSE. I'm just wondering if there's any contradiction between the fact that London does have this dominance and but it's so restricted in its growth and under a whole bricolage of different planning regulations and kind of viewing corridors, etc. And this is very inquisitive, but do you think there's any potential that London's dominance in fields such as financial services and insurance and business, etc., is partly fueled by the fact that the central London has become almost a ghetto of exclusive for the kinds of people that work in these industries, and does that in turn bring its own kinds of agglomeration?
Great. So 3 questions. Nick, laissez-faire or more proactive in terms of the planning? Immigration, is it important? How does it help our cities? And then actually have the restrictions that have been put in place in London for the best part of 50 or 60 years, have they actually helped create the kind of agglomeration benefits that we now see?
Laissez-faire or more proactive, I don't have a very strong view here, except to fear that proactive planning is hugely subject to government failure. And that's essentially what we've seen over the last several decades. So I think I want to direct you, I don't necessarily want to move entirely to free for all. So I think you posed me something which was a bit too much of a binary choice. I think we can relax restrictions somewhat without, beneficially, without going all the way to full laissez-faire. So for example, the sort of thing that we might be quite interested in doing, I think, is seeing if we can devise better incentives for local communities actually not to want to oppose expansion. I think that's the sort of thing that I would be interested in trying to devise. I know there have been plans around and they've not ever come to fruition. The Loining plan for community land auctions, for example, is one such. So it's not impossible to change the incentive structures a bit without abandoning the mechanism of planning altogether. I do have a feeling that one bit of the planning system which I really would want to think has become a sacred cow is the green belt. And the green belt, it seems to me, would be one of my first prongs of attack. And I think about the sort of stuff that Paul Cheshire did on the drab agricultural land around our city peripheries, the different use values that it has. There seems to be a really rather sad misallocation of resources there. So I think I'd go for some things like that rather than trying to abolish everything. And my proactive, I'm sure you're an excellent planner, so I probably shouldn't say that.
Don't answer that. Don't answer that.
The second,
Immigration.
second question was immigration. That's not entirely my subject, but I did have some tuition from that, from a couple of people recently, including Jonathan Porters and my old student Tim Hatton. I think the really interesting question here is the extent to which immigration raises the productivity of the incumbent workforce. I think a lot of the statistics which are cited about immigration are sort of not quite getting at that. They're producing some kind of average number which is about, does it increase GDP? I think the interesting question for, let's call them the indigenous, the folk already here, if I can use that expression, is if letting more migration in has economic benefits for them. I think the evidence is yes, it does, but we're not altogether on very solid ground. We're not too sure what the magnitudes are. And I think we do come back to the issue that was raised when I blanked the screen, that even if that is the case, I think the average voter probably doesn't feel it. So that whether or not it's the case doesn't have, what shall I say, political purchase, if that's the right phrase. Remind me what the third question was.
So this was the question about whether some restrictions on London have actually benefited it, at least until relatively recently.
Well, it seems to me that if you think about restrictions on London, they were at their tightest actually in the 1950s and 1960s. That London became what it is today as some of those controls were relaxed. And for example, the financial district was allowed to move into Canary Wharf, in a way which was just not, I think, a possibility before that. So I don't think it's entirely through restriction. I think the question that you might be wanting to ask is, does this financial district entirely revolve around the people living next to it? I think not. I think the right way to understand how a city works is in terms of the people who work in it, not just those who live in it. If we think about London, surely the prime feature of 20th century London, though not 19th century London, is the volume of commuting. And it is commuters who make up that urban workforce, and it's facilitating commuting which has essentially been our alternative to allowing London to sprawl even more than it was allowed to in the interwar period. Right. So I think it's the size of the workforce, not necessarily who can live there. But if that's right, then it does suggest that if we allow the transport system to underperform and get clogged up, then we basically limit that workforce. So let me actually just add one more thought, that on my London as a financial centre slide, I had in mind that what new technology does is take out, and has been taking out, some of the need for expensive real estate. That you put your backroom operations somewhere remote, and that actually makes it easier for this very high-paid core business to stay.
Great. So time is against us, but I'm going to take one more round of questions. Three. I've got one at the front, one at the back, and I've got a gentleman over there, and I'm going to take the chairman, otherwise you would give me a lot of grief. So Ben at the front, and then the gentleman there. Ben.
Ben Plowden, my day job is working for Transport for London, but it's actually a question around Jacobian externalities.
Yeah.
Clearly London's economy is quite diverse in the sense that there are people working in lots of different sectors. Is it specifically internationally traded sectors that need to be concentrated where Jacobian diversity is not helpful, or is it generally, because clearly not everyone in London works in the financial sector, it's a major international area. I wasn't clear whether it's specific in terms of international trade or just more generally that there's a disadvantage to or an advantage to be diverse.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Simon Khan, I'm an architect and designer. I'd like to raise the whole issue of HS2. Do you think it's going to suck people down to London, or is it going to pull people up to Birmingham and Leeds and Manchester? And do you think the HS3 integration of transport around the north is a better solution, and you don't really need HS2 at all?
Great, yeah, just give the mic there. Great. You never have a conference or any session where HS2 is not raised. That issue about whether sucking and pulling and all the rest of it. Anyway,
Keith Thorpe from Department for Communities and Local Government. I just wondered what the messages were for what you've been saying for city governance. Putting city regions more in control of their own economies. will this generally improve their ability to adjust more flexibly to globalisation and also help to challenge the dominance of London? Or, is it really going to be as effective as people think?
Great. So, issues around Jacobian diversity and how that interplays with international traded services, HS2, HS3, and devolution very much in vogue. Do you think that's going to make much difference? And I'll add one more thought, question for you to finish on, Nick. We hear a lot about if only we'd done policy differently, the UK could look much more like Germany. And I want to get your thoughts on whether that's a sensible thing to be talking about or not. So, if only we'd done policy differently, we could be much more like Germany. More manufacturing, more spatially distributed economy, and all the rest. Over to you.
Okay, let's take them in the order that they came up. I think the Marshalian story is quite general. It's not just about things which are tradable. I emphasise things which are tradable because I think it plays into what you're able to sustain in international trade. And economists traditionally were very prone to look at things through a quite different lens and forget about those effects. So probably I a bit over-egged the pudding by mentioning that so often. But I think it's a more general argument. Okay, second one. I think I have to declare an interest at this point. I live in South Warwickshire. The town in which I live is plastered with stop HS2. HS2 will go past my garden. It will be between me and my job in the university, except I think retire. But nevertheless, I'll try and give you... yeah. So, I mean, do take what I say with a pinch of salt. I have to say I'm pretty sceptical about the case for HS2. I am so because I was on the Eddington report, which looked at Britain's transport system. You may not remember. I had a big report in 2006, and we put a lot of work into that. We spent a lot of time looking at the inadequacies of the transport system. We came to the conclusion that Britain had underinvested very seriously, but it had mainly underinvested in roads, and in particular in things like intra-urban improvements in roads where that's feasible. It's fairly clear at that time that the numbers, insofar as one can do a cost-benefit analysis on a scheme of this kind, and I think we all know that benefit-cost analyses work much better for rather small schemes where essentially in economics jargon it's a kind of partial equilibrium story. So there's some pinch of salt here, but the benefit-cost case for HS2 does not look particularly strong, and that's assuming it comes in on budget. Because the one thing we really do know about grand projets, particularly one-off projets, look at all the evidence accumulated in the literature, they are the ones which typically have the case hugely overstated. The benefits are usually lower, the costs are always higher. So if the numbers come in marginal now, I suspect they'll come in sub-marginal in future. I think there is a lot to be said for connecting up the northern cities, but again, I wonder if improvements to road aren't better. If there's a capacity problem on the West Coast Main Line, as some people would say, again, I suspect there are cheaper ways of addressing that than trying to create HS2. Before I was on the Eddington report, I was on something called SACTRA, briefly, the Standing Advisory Committee on Trunk Road Assessment. In that book, we put the splendid phrase, we got all sorts of, every municipality in the country, it seemed, wanted a new road built because it would regenerate them. We put very heavily in the book, please remember that roads allow two-way traffic. So does HS2. So I'm not convinced on the basis of the evidence. I think incidentally the House of Lords Committee last week did a reasonable job in raising some serious questions. I'm an HS2 sceptic, but as I told you at the start, I'm a hugely prejudiced person. So you should discard the whole of that answer as sort of party pre or whatever the technical term is. City governance, I think, was the next one. I think there is clearly a logical case for thinking that there are issues which are well dealt with at the greater city area. And this is really, I think, about internalising externalities, and it's about arranging governance areas to help us realise the benefits of the spillovers. So that's an economist's answer. I think you probably want a political scientist to explain to you whether or not we're capable of devising a city governance framework which would deliver that. But in principle, I would like to believe we should have been doing more for quite a long time. Andrew, I think yours was the last question. Could we be like West Germany? Well, I think the answer to that is that old Irish remark, I wouldn't start from here. What I have in mind, though, is that the reason, well, there are various reasons why we have a smaller manufacturing sector, but I think they relate much more to the institutional architecture than the spatial architecture. They're about an economy which doesn't have patient capital. They're about issues to do with corporate governance. They're about the difference between what my old colleague David Soskis calls a liberal market economy and a coordinated market economy. I think his work makes a very good case for saying that a coordinated market economy is likely to have a much larger manufacturing sector, and in fact to invest and accumulate some of the things like human capital, which are necessary to have the successful manufacturing sector that Germany does. So I don't in this case think it's the planning system which is at fault. I'd like to be able to blame the planning system for everything. But indeed. But in this case I don't think it is. But I don't think it's something we could address by tweaking industrial policy. You know, I'm not convinced that the industrial strategy, had it been adopted 30 years ago, would have made very much difference to the size of manufacturing that we've got. And I think it is incredibly difficult to replace one set of institutions with another. So I think you're really actually condemned to follow the comparative advantage that your institutions deliver. And I think for us that's much more services than manufacturing.
And on that note, let me bring to a close the formal proceedings. If you could join with me to thank Professor Crafts and the usual